Canada is changing, and many Canadians are asking a hard question. Is this still our country, or have we lost our identity forever? Today, we dive deep into the heart of Canada's identity crisis and uncover what's really happening. Chapter 1. The Roots of Canadian Identity. To understand Canada's current identity crisis, we must first look back at its roots. Canada has always been a nation defined by complexity, born out of Indigenous nations, shaped by French and British colonial influence, and forged into a federation that balanced unity with diversity. Unlike countries that rely on one dominant culture, Canada built itself on compromise and coexistence. The original Canadian identity was layered. Indigenous peoples carried centuries of traditions tied to the land. French settlers added language and Catholic traditions, while the British brought law, governance, and Protestant institutions. Instead of blending into one, these cultures coexisted under uneasy alliances, eventually formalized in the Confederation of 1867. For decades, Canada's image to the world was one of modesty, resilience, and multicultural pride. Canadians celebrated hockey, maple syrup, Mounties, and the red and white flag as symbols that could unify everyone, no matter their origin. By the 1970s, multiculturalism became official policy, positioning Canada as the first nation in the world to adopt it at a federal level. On the surface, multiculturalism seemed like Canada's great gift to the world. Instead of forcing assimilation, Canada promised newcomers they could keep their languages, faiths, and traditions while still being Canadian. The cultural mosaic was celebrated as stronger than America's melting pot. But beneath the optimism, cracks were already forming. What does it mean to be Canadian when no single unifying identity exists? Was Canadian identity simply a patchwork of different communities living side by side, or was there something deeper? These questions were left unanswered, and decades later, they would resurface in explosive ways. Immigration waves in the late 20th century, from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, reshaped the demographic map. With every wave, Canada reinvented its self-image. But with each reinvention, older generations worried about losing the traditions they grew up with. For many Canadians, identity was rooted in simple shared values: respect for freedom, politeness, fairness, and a love of the outdoors. But as the country diversified further, even those values began to clash with competing worldviews. What one community considered Canadian politeness, another dismissed as weakness. What one group valued as religious freedom, another saw as cultural erasure. Canada's foundation was always fragile. Its unity was less about shared culture and more about shared ideals. And today, those ideals are being tested like never before. Chapter 2. Immigration and Cultural Shifts. Immigration has always been central to Canada's story, but the scale of recent years is unprecedented. Today, Canada admits nearly 500,000 new immigrants per year, the highest intake per capita of any G7 country. In addition, over 1 million temporary residents, students, workers, and refugees arrive annually, reshaping communities faster than infrastructure can adapt. This has caused visible cultural shifts, especially in urban centres. In Toronto, for example, more than half of the population is foreign-born. Walk through neighbourhoods in Mississauga, Brampton, Vancouver, or Surrey, and you'll hear dozens of languages, see storefronts catering to specific ethnic groups, and notice how traditional Canadian symbols fade into the background. Supporters call this cultural richness a strength. They argue Canada thrives because it welcomes the world. But critics point out that instead of blending, many newcomers cluster into enclaves where integration is minimal. Whole cities begin to reflect the identity of immigrant-majority populations, leaving Canadian-born residents feeling like outsiders in their own communities. Housing is one of the most obvious areas of strain. As hundreds of thousands arrive each year, demand skyrockets while supply lags far behind. Home prices in Ontario and British Columbia have soared, creating bidding wars that pit middle-class Canadians against wealthier newcomers. Renters face the same crisis, with affordability collapsing at historic rates. Healthcare is another stress point. Hospitals and clinics, already under pressure from aging populations, now face longer lines and overburdened systems. Canadians who once prided themselves on universal healthcare increasingly complain about wait times, overcrowding, and staff shortages, challenges made worse by rapid population growth. Employment shows the same tension. While immigration is often justified as filling labor shortages, many Canadian-born workers say they face unfair competition in industries where employers prefer cheaper immigrant labor. Young Canadians, especially recent graduates, struggle to find entry-level opportunities as companies favor skilled foreign workers willing to accept lower wages. These realities fuel resentment. For many, immigration no longer feels like a solution, but a driver of crisis. A divide has opened between those who celebrate multiculturalism and those who feel their identity and opportunities are being erased by it. The central question remains: is immigration enriching Canada's identity or rewriting it entirely? Chapter 3: Political and Economic Pressures. Immigration is not just a demographic issue, it's a political one. Canadian political parties openly compete for immigrant votes. Policies are crafted not necessarily to preserve Canada's culture or stability, but to secure loyalty from growing communities who now hold the power to decide election outcomes. In cities like Brampton, where immigrant populations dominate, political campaigns are tailored almost entirely to their interests. Leaders attend cultural events, pose for photos in ethnic garb, and make promises that prioritize immigrant-heavy districts over long-standing Canadian communities. Economically, the argument for high immigration rests on growth. Canada's leaders argue that newcomers are needed to support pensions, fill labor shortages, and keep the economy competitive. But in practice, ordinary Canadians feel the opposite. Wages remain stagnant, while the cost of living rises faster than ever. The average Canadian is working harder, yet falling further behind. The housing crisis, for example, has reached record levels. Home prices in Toronto and Vancouver are among the highest in the world compared to average incomes. Young Canadians who once dreamed of owning property now call themselves the renter generation. They blame not just developers and government mismanagement, but also policies that bring in more people than the system can handle. Inflation adds to the tension. Everyday Canadians see food prices climb, utilities rise, and taxes increase, all while watching billions spent on settlement services, refugee programs, and foreign aid. For many, the promise that immigration boosts the economy rings hollow when their wallets tell a different story. Politically, Canadians feel trapped. Speaking against immigration is often labelled as intolerant, yet ignoring the economic and social consequences only deepens frustration. The silence around these issues creates an identity vacuum where people no longer feel represented by their leaders. At the same time, global pressures, climate change, wars, refugee flows, and economic instability push Canada to accept even more newcomers. But each decision made in the name of compassion or global responsibility adds weight to the identity crisis at home. The once stable image of Canada as a land of fairness and opportunity now feels like a myth. For many, the new reality is one of overcrowding, competition, and cultural fragmentation, where politics serve demographics, not the nation. Chapter 4: The Cultural Divide. Perhaps the most visible symptom of Canada's identity crisis is the cultural divide. Walk through the streets of Brampton or Surrey and you'll find entire neighbourhoods reflecting cultures not traditionally Canadian. While diversity is supposed to mean coexistence, the reality looks more like parallel societies. In schools, Canadian-born children often find themselves as minorities in classrooms where the dominant languages, customs, and priorities are imported. Teachers struggle to balance inclusivity with preserving Canadian traditions, leaving students caught in a cultural tug-of-war. In cities, signs in foreign languages dominate plazas. Religious festivals from abroad overshadow national holidays. Traditional Canadian markers like Canada Day, hockey, or Thanksgiving no longer hold universal significance. Critics argue this is not multiculturalism, it's cultural displacement. When a country's own traditions are sidelined in favor of imported practices, its national identity weakens. For older generations, this feels like losing the Canada they grew up in. This divide also breeds resentment. Long-time Canadians, particularly in smaller towns, increasingly feel alienated from the multicultural urban centres. They see cities becoming unrecognizable, and they ask, who is Canada really for? Meanwhile, newcomers sometimes feel unaccepted by Canadians who see them as outsiders. The lack of integration deepens isolation on both sides, fueling a cycle of mistrust. Protests, debates, and even extremist rhetoric have grown louder as Canadians demand answers. What is the balance between celebrating diversity and protecting national identity? The hard truth is that without shared culture, a nation loses its glue. Canada risks becoming less a country and more a collection of separate communities living side by side with little to unite them. Chapter 5. The Future of Canada's Identity. The question now is simple but urgent. What is Canada becoming? Is it a nation with a clear identity, or a land where identity has no meaning at all? If immigration continues at record levels, demographics will keep shifting rapidly. In just a few decades, Canadian-born citizens may no longer form the majority in major provinces. Already this is the case in parts of Ontario and British Columbia. Economically, the cost of sustaining such rapid growth could overwhelm systems. Healthcare may collapse under strain, housing may become permanently unaffordable, and social safety nets may break. Politically, parties may stop appealing to a Canadian identity altogether and instead focus only on identity-based blocs, further fragmenting the nation. The dream of a united Canada could become an outdated fantasy. And yet there is hope. Canada's identity has always been adaptable. If Canadians can reclaim shared values, respect, fairness, freedom, and community, they can find unity beyond heritage or politics. Protecting Canadian traditions does not mean excluding newcomers. It means teaching them what Canada stands for and ensuring integration is a two-way street. The choice is clear. Either Canada redefines its identity around shared values that transcend demographics, or it loses that identity altogether. The next generation will decide which path the country takes. The question, is this still our country, is not rhetorical. It's a warning. Canada's future depends on whether its people, both new and old, choose to preserve the heart of what makes the nation unique. If you believe Canada's identity is worth protecting, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more deep dives into the issues shaping our future. And let us know in the comments, do you still feel like Canada is your country?